Randall Abate is Chair of Marine and Environmental Law and Policy at Monmouth University in New Jersey, where he teaches in the Department of Political Science and Sociology. Professor Abate joined the Monmouth faculty in 2018 after 24 years of full-time law instruction at 6 U.S. law schools, and he has spoken about environmental and animal law topics in many different countries around the world. His work now centers on climate justice and the intersection between animal and environmental law. Randall has published 5 books, including his most recent, Climate Change and the Voiceless, Protecting Future Generations, Wildlife, and Natural Resources. And he's here to speak with us today about what the legal system can and should be doing about climate change. And thank you for taking that time today, Randall.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
It's wonderful to have you. I'm really curious about your journey into plant-based living, and you had mentioned that you're not quite vegan yet, and I just want to thank you for knowing the difference between being plant-based and being a full-on ethical vegan. But I'm really curious about when you started the shift away and why you started the shift away from the traditional standard American diet, which is ironically called the SAD.
Well, it's an unusual journey, to be sure, and one that I'm not proud of, in the sense that I really didn't even think about transitioning away from the omnivore lifestyle I had my entire life until I prepared to teach animal law for the first time. And that's when it really became much clearer to me, not just the moral impetus to make that transition, but I started to become more informed about how the transition to plant-based diet is also very good for the environment and for one's health. There were so many myths that I grew up with regarding the virtues of an omnivore's diet that it never occurred to me that I'd be able to be very healthy and obtain adequate protein and all the other myths out there about the dangers of being anything but on a meat-based diet. So once I taught animal law, it was just very easy to make the transition, and it went pretty fast in the grand scheme of things, given that I spent almost the first 50 years of my life without even thinking about it, and became a vegetarian virtually overnight, and then phased out different parts of my diet 1 year at a time, pretty much, dairy, eggs, and transitioning as far as I can to being almost exclusively at all times plant-based. And then the rest of the lifestyle is in the works. I'm transitioning to vegan cosmetics and clothing to the extent that I'm able with my crazy lifestyle right now, but it's absolutely the goal.
It's really eye-opening how all pervasive the animal ingredients are once you start to realize they're everywhere. And so, as you say, it's a big transition for sure.
It really is. And my son is vegan, and I always recall how difficult the transition is to be complete. When I reached to pick up my favorite breath mint, and he looked at the ingredients and said, Dad, that is animal gelatin. And I felt somewhat defeated, but also more determined to get more information and keep pressing on.
Well, good for you. That's wonderful to be on the pathway for sure. I'm curious, was there anything in particular about the animal law that really you went, oh my gosh, okay, I understand, I need to start changing things?
Well, I really think that it was this fog that most of us live in with the meat-based diet, that it's just something that is never thought about. And there's so much more publicity about it now, which is a good thing. So I think many people now are clinging to that because it's comfortable, because it's consistent with their cultural values, because it tastes good, but they're doing it despite that awareness that there's other choices. And in my approach to my diet, it just never occurred to me. I mean, I would certainly avoid obviously unhealthy eating that was associated with a meat-based diet. I've been a competitive athlete my whole life, but it just never occurred to me about that ongoing ethical dimension to food choices that was not on my radar for so long until I taught animal law, until I was just reminded at every stage of the game how animal exploitation is something that is unnecessary and avoidable. And just because we've done it for a long time and do it on a wide scale basis does not make it appropriate or the right thing to do.
Right. And I think part of it, once you start to step away and live a plant-based lifestyle, then you really start to realize, as you say, the ingredients in the breath mints and even just on television, the amount of animal-based advertising. And then I think, well, that must be why they never tell us about this stuff that we have to find out on our own. It seems like is because I guess, they're corporations that are profit seeking, and their profits are coming from advertising money, and so their hands are tied, I suppose.
Yeah, it's just completely pervasive. And so as someone who is at the intersection of animal law and environmental law the way I am, my focus has been very much on factory farms, as this is the low-hanging fruit of making a huge impact on our society and of course on the lives of animals. If we can just improve our efforts to take down factory farming, phase out from that incredibly harmful activity on so many levels, then I think the rest of it will follow. It's just that approach of eating animals and producing them in that way for consumption is just the root of all of the other evils. That's kind of what's made it permissible to just exploit animals across society.
Yeah, and I've recently learned in Canada that there aren't even really, there isn't much regulation. Like there's sort of a regulatory body that's comprised of people from within the industry. So they're sort of regulating themselves. Is it the same in the US?
Absolutely, and this is something that I'm writing about now, that how difficult it is to penetrate this industry because they aren't regulated on many levels for their environmental harms. There are very limited protections, of course, for the animals that are exploited in these facilities. And likewise, the workers who work there are similarly exploited. And the challenge to compound that challenge, we've got government subsidies enabling this destruction that's already catastrophic. And so you have to peel back these layers of how difficult it is to undo all of this harm. And then another layer is that their operations are shrouded in secrecy, which is very different from other forms of impact to the environment. In the US, certainly our regulatory system of air pollution, water pollution, land-based pollution is very much based on a model of transparency and accountability, that the public knows what you're putting into different media of the environment, and you are ultimately accountable for that. And if you exceed what you're permitted to release or emit, you will be sued and you'll lose. You'll be subject to civil and criminal penalties. But with factory farms, there is not that transparency and accountability. And compounding that even further in the US and Canada is this tradition of ag-gag laws, which penalizes even your attempts to try to penetrate that fortress of secrecy. So it's just incredible how insulated this industry is from the public's ability to seek justice. And that's been a long fight, and that's one that I'm very much involved in now and very determined to see it through.
Well, that's awesome. Because I just recently signed a petition because there are increasing numbers of ag-gag laws in Canada. It seems like Alberta has one, and then there's one in Ontario now, and there's an attempt to try to get a national one. And then, so I signed the petition was about preventing prison labor from being used in animal agriculture and slaughterhouses, I guess. So I'm thinking, well, then there's no whistleblowing at all if they could just use prison labor. And I
Right.
know, yeah, in the US they use prison labor for all kinds of things, including firefighting. Have you heard of that sort of thing?
I have not. I'm not as familiar with that, but certainly it's just another way in which any industry that is not accountable to the public can get away with virtually anything. And that's really what we're seeing. And so the connection that I make between environmental law and animal law is to try to have animal law learn from some of the victories that environmental law has secured. And one of them is this model of transparency and accountability that has worked so well in environmental law in other contexts. And the other reality is that environmentalists, like I have been and was before I came into the animal law world, environmentalists need to be more concerned about factory farms as an environmental issue and as a social and, of course, animal protection issue. And it's been remarkable to me that the world's these two camps that seem to be ideologically aligned in many ways are so different that when I'm among environmental law professors, maybe 5% are vegan or vegetarian. When I'm among animal law professors, about 90% of them are vegan or vegetarian. So it shouldn't be that kind of contrast in terms of the choices they're making with respect to animals. They're very much on the same team and yet have very different views to their how they approach their food choices.
Mm-hmm. I just heard this morning that the Game Changers documentary is becoming the most watched documentary ever in history. So maybe we just need to sit these environmentalists down in front of that. I think that it's a very impactful documentary, among others, because it just goes to show, I think, the extent of the programming. You know, it's something that we do every day, and it's just easier not to think about it, right? But that's where I thought, hey, go ahead.
Well, but one thing that I wanted to add there is that the power of documentaries has really been so impactful, and that I find somewhat encouraging. I mean, many of the pieces of information that I know now and have built on about this connection between factory farming and environmental impacts came from the documentary Cowspiracy. It was just something that was not laid out for me in that way prior to 2014 in that documentary, which is remarkable because it's been a long-standing environmental problem, but the environmental movement ignored it. We were more concerned about polar bears and coal-fired power plants and just completely ignored factory farms as an environmental issue. And it's especially disturbing because it was ignored in the era of climate change and how factory farms are massive carbon footprints and sources of methane, that we are just suicidal to ignore that as an environmental problem.
Yeah, it seems to me that's really where the intersection should happen, I think, is regarding climate law, because the impacts on the water and the carbon dioxide and all the rest of it, it seems that it's incontrovertible. So what some environmental victories you mentioned? Let's talk about some environmental victories that have kind of led the law in a different direction. Maybe we can learn something from that for animals too.
Well, I think in my book, the What Can Animal Law Learn from Environmental Law, there are many ways in which environmental law is a more mature movement. It's been around much longer and it's more deeply entrenched than animal law is in our society in the US and otherwise. And I think first and foremost, one way that environmental law was able to achieve the success that it has is by linking environmental concerns to human health and safety concerns. So in other words, the environmental movement didn't become victorious because it was a bunch of tree huggers who care about nature. It should have been able to achieve victories with that lens, but it didn't. Instead, environmental law in the US was very much based on science-driven determinations that pollution was causing severe public health and safety problems. And that really, in the end, doesn't have that much to do with the environment. It has to do with protecting ourselves from the harm we're imposing on the planet. And that's how our Clean Air Act and our Clean Water Act and our hazardous waste laws were founded. It wasn't about this concern for the environment as a holistic entity with intrinsic value. It was about a concern for the way we were contaminating the world around us and how we needed to protect ourselves from those impacts of pollution. So if you apply that to animals, then you've got a situation where animal law is fundamentally different. Animal law is driven by this moral concern that we should respect the dignity of animals and not exploit them. And it's not connecting the issue of animal protection to human gain and protection the way environmental law did.
Okay, so if it's true, then I think the Clean Air Act and those are all about emissions, right? And capping emissions and cleanup, but they don't really get to the source of, and if we look at the source of a lot of that is coming because of animal agriculture, right? So is there a way to connect that up?
Absolutely. There's a lot of discussion about that now. I mean, if you look at the Clean Water Act, for instance, you're right that the focus is about emissions, end of pipe discharges, as we call them, from particular facilities. So that's called point source pollution. It comes from a pipe or a discrete conveyance into a water body. But there's a whole nother form of pollution that's equally difficult or harmful to the environment, and yet is much more difficult to regulate, and that's called non-point source pollution. And the biggest source of non-point source pollution is animal agriculture. So the idea is that this form of pollution is much more diffuse. It's not coming from a discrete conveyance, but an entire factory farm is the source for massive water contamination. And ultimately, how do you regulate that the way you would regulate a discharge from a pipe directly into a stream? And there are ways to do that. I mean, the Clean Water Act is much more sophisticated that way. The problem goes back to our earlier discussion in that because animal agriculture is protected by government subsidies and just regulatory loopholes, they're in many ways exempt from those efforts to regulate non-point source pollution that other sources might be subject to. So it's a huge political challenge to really get the industrial animal agriculture problem surrounded by the necessary political will to make sure it is called to task.
Yeah, because I'm not real clear on how laws happen, but I know it has something to do with government at some level passing these things. So if a government is actually invested in an industry, then they're not going to want to prevent or enact laws that are going to, you know, cause that industry to stop making profits, I guess. Is that what happens?
That's exactly it. And that's what the lobbyists are doing. Whether we're talking about lobbyists for animal agriculture or lobbyists for guns or lobbyists for the pharmaceutical industry, it's all about protecting those industries from regulation that would harm their ability to make profits.
Hmm. Okay, so in other countries, I think you have talked about how I think New Zealand has had some success in passing laws that actually protect rivers, was it? And I think in Bolivia, didn't they created some kind of a document. So are there examples that we can draw upon for animals in the earth?
There are, and in the second edition of my book, there is a chapter that speaks to this very point. And the idea is that there are definite similarities when we talk about assigning legal personhood for nature and assigning legal personhood to animals. Both of these entities, these classes of entities, are unlike humans. They can't speak for themselves. They need the law to step in and say, even though you can't go up and speak for yourself in a courtroom the way humans do, you are nonetheless worthy of legal protection because of your intrinsic value. And ultimately, you will be protected by the law. You will have legal guardians appointed to represent your interests after the law has come in and said you do have those interests. And so we've seen this come up in a variety of contexts. It's happening in the US, just not as successfully, but prominent examples are in New Zealand. The Wanganui River was determined to have legal personhood that is now represented by a joint guardianship model of Indigenous peoples, the Maori tribe, and the government. So that's a work in progress. What does it mean for the river to have legal personhood? Does it mean it can't be polluted at all? Maybe not, but it certainly has a higher level of protection with personhood than it did without it. And likewise, we've seen courts recognize legal personhood for rivers. We've seen it in India with the Ganges, and in Colombia with the Atrato River in the Amazon. So whether we're talking about a legislative recognition, like we saw in New Zealand, or judicial recognition, there's a lot happening now with this idea of non-human entities having legal personhood that can then be represented when it's challenged in court by humans who are the mouthpiece for those non-human entities. So that helps a lot, and it's very new, and it's happening all over the world now. And it's exciting to think about it as a platform for protecting animals, because we're also seeing lawsuits now that are looking to establish animal rights in a way that is a more limited subset of human rights. So, of course, animals are not going to be able to secure the right to marry and the right to vote, but they ought to be able to secure the right to be free from torture and free from confinement as a starting point. And so these animal rights efforts are very much based on those rights of nature efforts to say, okay, these non-human entities deserve protection. They're different from humans, but they still deserve a class of rights that can be enforced under the law.
So it seems like there's an intersection then with Indigenous law as well. And,
Absolutely.
and but then, lawyers have to make a living and are often very expensive. So how do how do these things come about, unless there are lawyers like yourself who just care enough to do it? But, you still have to pay the bills. Like, how does that part of it work?
Well, the good news is that on issues like these, there are many organizations that are available that are not your typical $400 an hour corporate lawyer representation. There are a lot of non-governmental organizations now that are funded by donors and grants, and ultimately are there to be the voice of nature or to be the voice of animals. And so, to the extent that they are seeking representation, they are able to secure the legal help they need, because these organizations are about, they're driven by their passion for the issue, and they're driven by the passion to shape the law in a direction that's going to give more protection in the future to these entities. So it's their cause, and they are not going to bankrupt any entities that are seeking their representation. So that's been very encouraging, both on the environmental side and the animal side. There's been just an explosion of these kinds of organizations that are seeking to protect rights of nature and animal rights in the past decade.
Well, that's good. So they're dependent on donations, I guess. They're set up as charities or whatever. It'd be nice
Yes.
to somehow enact this into system change, eventually. But in the meantime, I guess this is how it's happening. And so that brings to mind a couple of lawsuits that have been launched, I think just recently, really recently, by the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine from Washington and Mercy for Animals organization. And these are specifically regarding COVID and other infections that are coming out of animal production facilities and slaughterhouses. Are you familiar with those lawsuits?
Yes, I am, and I'm encouraged by them, because my view of where we are in history is that every disaster is an opportunity for reform, and it's terrible to think that way, and I never cheer for someone else's loss. But ultimately, if you look at climate change and you want to have more ambitious action to regulate climate change, at some level, you're encouraged by a year like 2020. It has been one climate catastrophe after the other. If this isn't putting climate change on our radar to say, this is an emergency, it's not some obscure threat 50 years into the future. This is happening today all around us, and it needs to be regulated like it's a direct threat, like post 9/11 terrorism regulation. It's something that haunts us on a daily basis, just like other threats that we've actively regulated. So in the example of COVID, as catastrophic a crisis as this is for humanity, it's ultimately advancing the causes for both enhanced environmental protection and enhanced protection of animals. These lawsuits are about how the industrial animal agriculture industry has not been adequately protecting the public from the threat of COVID, and how these facilities are breeding grounds for diseases like COVID and others we don't yet know, and how there's a need for greater regulation, greater information to the public to protect the consuming public from the threats that these facilities are harboring. And ultimately, in the face of those threats, recently we've seen efforts to increase the speed of slaughter lines in 2020 at a time when we need to be much more careful and protective of these facilities' impacts on the public, and of course on the animals and the workers in these facilities first and foremost. But this is something that is literally dispensing pandemics on the public in a way that needs to be much more carefully regulated. So the PCRM suit takes that public health perspective that I mentioned, that environmental law has done so well in the past. This is what animal law needs. It needs something like COVID to link animal protection to public health concerns, and then we're going to see more political will around, gee, maybe we need to reform our food system if we want a safe future.
Right. And so what my understanding is, PCRM is suggesting that it's possible, it's quite likely that the COVID can come out of the animal production facilities in the form of food packaging, and that it stays alive on the packaging in the refrigerator, and people take it home. And then so they're, we're never going to get rid of this thing that way unless people quit buying the product. And they're asking for, testing. There's no testing going on inside these facilities, and at least some kind of a warning system. Yeah.
And that's again where animal law can learn from environmental law, because there's so much effective information dissemination going on in the environmental law field. So a couple of prominent examples would be the Community Right to Know Act, which is connected to a hazardous waste law in the US. And ultimately the law provides that people have a right to know where there are potential areas of danger that could harm their public health with the threat of hazardous chemicals. They're entitled to access that information to better inform how to protect themselves. And likewise, this is something that absolutely should be coming from the factory farm sector when we think about how labeling can be a very effective tool for public information. And we don't yet have that. We don't yet have this idea of information like that on a package of meat, for example. It doesn't have the carbon footprint of the production process for that. It doesn't have the impact on animal welfare on that package. So when you think about other contexts, just think about a pack of cigarettes. Think about how terrible that was for the tobacco industry. Here, buy our product. It's probably going to kill you because we have to put this warning on it that it's going to cause cancer, but go ahead and buy it anyway. This is really the kind of precedent that environmental law can transfer over to animal law and require that packaging information to inform the public to make the choices that are in their interest. They may decide to buy the product anyway and take the risk, but they ought to be entitled to have that information and make their own choice.
Well, and we know that processed meat is a carcinogenic, and so certainly perhaps that it should indicate that, and also the connection to heart attacks and diabetes and cancers and dementia and all the rest of it. But I've heard plant-based doctors speaking about this in terms of tobacco, and how the tobacco industry that really provided a precedent. The tobacco industry fought so hard against that, and doctors used to actually smoke in their offices and that sort of thing. And so now the meat and dairy has sort of taken a page from that, and they've learned how to plant seeds of doubt, is what the doctors say. So
Absolutely.
this is so many challenges. So, but it's really about, I think it really comes back to educating people. So as an educator, what kind of reactions do you get from students when you present this?
What I love most about presenting this information, whether it be to a group of students in a class or to a general audience with a lecture, is that this is information that's not readily available to the public. And so I feel very empowered and passionate to share this kind of information with the public so that they can make better decisions for themselves. because that was kind of the awakening I had when I started to research teaching animal law for the first time, how I had no idea there was such pervasive animal exploitation across society, and how important it was for animals and the environment and my health to make a transition to a plant-based diet. So the students are very receptive. They're shocked, of course, initially. But what is really the most resounding victory, I think, in teaching this course is that every time I teach the course, without any kind of proselytizing, just sharing of information, about 25 to 35% of my students go vegetarian or vegan. I mean, literally within the span of a few weeks of getting this information. And so that to me shows how powerful information is and how unfortunate the current system is with all of the shrouding of this information, that even very well educated people, even people who are trained as environmental lawyers and professors, don't even know until they immerse themselves in the field of animal law. So that I find very empowering, and the students do as well. And many of them become very attached to the agenda and seek to pursue animal and environmental law intersections in their career paths.
Cool. That's awesome. And so, you know, speaking about climate, you know, that's really an international issue. COVID has helped us remember that we are an international community, but laws are very particularly local or maybe national at best, I suppose, in terms of protection. Is there kind of a community of lawyers that are working on these things, and you're all connected and chatting about it? Yeah.
Very much so. I mean, I think climate has united environmental lawyers more than any other issue. I mean, this is 3 decades now in the works that we've been aware of climate change as the ultimate existential threat to our survival on this planet. And not surprisingly, the political will has been slower than it should be. There have been a lot of political clashes on this issue. Not surprisingly, the developed world, like the US and Canada, have already had their bite at the apple with development. They've already polluted the planet more than their fair share. They're living comfortably in economically advanced societies, and they aren't terribly motivated to essentially allow the developing world to have their chance and pollute the environment in the way that the developed world did. Now that we're aware of our limited capacity to pollute in the era of climate change, they're not as willing to say everybody gets their bite at the apple and let's just destroy the planet. So you've got some countries, although Europe is a better example. Europe wants aggressive regulation on climate, and they've already developed, but they also want to enable this balance of developing countries having the right to develop, but in an environmentally sustainable way. And that requires financial and technological assistance from the developing world, from the developed world to the developing world. And that's where the US and Canada aren't carrying their fair burden in the process, that there's a need for more financial and technical assistance to flow from developed countries to developing countries, so that the developing world can have some sense of justice in developing their economies, but doing so in an environmentally protective way, now that we're aware of how much of a global threat climate change is. So there's been a lot of clash politically on that issue, but there's been a whole lot of talk. I mean, the environmental law community is very much aligned around the climate issue and trying to do its best. But ultimately, there are so many political and economic and scientific challenges in getting a united front to address climate change on a global basis. We're seeing much more effective progress at the national, the state, the local levels than we are at the global level. There's just too much political and social challenge in getting an effective global response right now. We've seen year after year these global climate change conventions reach stalemates because it's too complex an issue. It is the ultimate intersectional issue. It's like trying to make humanity better is really ultimately what climate change regulation amounts to, and that's hard to do in the span of a week, once a year.
Right. And especially also, I think, because, like in Canada, yeah, maybe we talk about, capping emissions and cleaning up the environment on the one hand, but then we have corporate mining companies going to these other nations and devastating their river supplies and drilling into mountains and so, and then the Brazilian rainforest being destroyed for food, mostly for burgers. And so there's that kind of cross-pollination as well. It seems so, I don't know, it seems to me like Indigenous law really, if anybody has a say, is there something to be held on to there? And are Indigenous people now having an opportunity to become lawyers and participate in this?
Well, their voice is much more prominent now in the era of climate change because we're actually looking to indigenous communities because of their indigenous environmental knowledge that has allowed them to adapt to environmental change for centuries. Now that knowledge is quite valuable to the rest of humanity to address climate change, to learn lessons of adaptation from the indigenous communities. So in that regard, they are certainly respected much more. Their input is valued much more. And they are also much more vocal because climate change regulation, even when we're trying to do the right thing and regulate climate change, there are some unintended consequences for indigenous communities around the world that are quite dangerous to their survival. So one example is this idea of RED. It's an acronym for reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. Essentially, what this means is that a developed country will pay a developing country to protect a stand of forest. Leave that forest intact. Do not cut it down to have palm oil plantations or cattle ranches. Just leave that forest intact. And so the reason why the developed country wants to pay the developing country to keep that forest intact is because they would then get the credits for the carbon that is sequestered in that forest. They would then get the credit for having reduced that amount of carbon in a carbon trading kind of scheme. So why is this dangerous for the indigenous peoples? Well, the way the management of this system works in the developing country is that the government gets that money and they're going to be in charge of keeping that forest protected from intrusion. And ultimately, what that trickles down to mean is that the indigenous peoples who have been inhabiting that forest for generations get kicked off of it. It is now government property to manage, and they are losing their culture and their livelihood because of this effort to save a little bit of carbon emission in that forest.
Oh, that's not good. I mean, we have a couple of tree sits going on right now in British Columbia, trying to protect some of the last remaining ancient old growth forests, temperate rainforests on the planet. So, I'm not sure we should be investing anywhere, as far as Canada goes, except it's such a battle. It's just such a battle.
Yes.
It's amazing. Okay, so we can support the people who are on the ground putting their bodies in the line of the bulldozers, I think, and trying to prevent the roads being built while you guys are doing what you can do in your legal world. One thing that you mentioned that's of interest is that you're writing an article about how the fossil fuel industry and industrial animal agriculture operations are common enemies in the fight against climate change. I guess we've kind of been talking about that. Is there anything else you want to mention about that?
Yeah, there is one sinister commonality that we haven't addressed between these two industries, and that is that they've had information about what is harmful, and not only have they disregarded that information and kept it from the public, but they have deliberately deceived the public in many ways in trying to cast doubt about the information that they know and the public doesn't. So there are just layers of sinister behavior, profit-driven behavior in both of these industries, and the efforts to try to hold them accountable are so much more difficult because it is such an imbalance in the playing field between those seeking to secure justice and those with all the power and all the money being protected by the government to continue to exploit the public so that they can profit even further. And these lawsuits now that are being brought against both sectors of the economy now, both fossil fuel and factory farm actors, they are making progress ultimately because it's taken years and years of failed attempts, different legal theories, different ways of promoting public information campaigns. But now I think in the era of climate change, we're seeing that common enemy reality become clearer, that if we're serious about addressing climate change to save the planet and our ability to have a sustainable future, these are the two bad habits of the past that have to go. We have to transition to clean and renewable energy as soon as possible, and we have to transition to a plant-based diet as soon as possible. Those two transitions will save us, and they shouldn't be in the distant future. The governments have the ability to promote those transitions, and we as the public have to remain persistent in allowing the legal system to expose and hold accountable these actors for the harm that they're doing. Because ultimately, if they aren't held accountable, it's ultimately the burden is being borne by the public, the taxpayers, the vulnerable communities that live just on the outskirts of these polluting factory farms. That's the worst kind of negative externality imaginable that's going to be continuing into the future. These super wealthy corporations are not paying their fair share for the harm they're doing to the environment and to public health, and they're getting obscene profits from it.
Mm. Yeah, the profit motive. I think a lot of horrible things happen just for that alone. And speaking about environmental impacts in neighboring communities, I think we call that environmental racism. It happens a lot, right? Where a corporation will intentionally place some facility in a poorer neighborhood, because knowing that they can't fight back. That's a common thing, right?
Absolutely, and we're seeing the same reality with factory farms. I mean, who are the communities living on the outskirts of those facilities? Those are the ones that are bearing the brunt of the burden of those environmental impacts, and they are typically minority, low-income communities that are shouldering their fair share of the problem. And with the environmental racism that was first coined as a reality in the late '80s, that was also true. Wherever you saw a landfill, a medical waste incinerator, heavy industry, those communities in the immediate vicinity were always going to be minority, low-income communities.
So when we talk about sustainable development, then, what really is that? Like, is it just a legal word? Is there something that we can really say this is sustainable? I mean, just living on the planet, 7 billion people on a planet is hard to become sustainable, I would think. But, in your estimation, what can we do that would be truly sustainable?
Well, sustainable development as a term has been around about 3 decades, and it's been largely rhetoric that we're trying to achieve some kind of lofty goal, some kind of standard by which we live, or try to live, but don't really act at the end of the day. And it's now, in the era of climate change, science is the key to making sustainable development move from rhetoric to reality. And that's another example for animal law to learn from environmental law. Environmental law standards are very much science driven. As we've said earlier in this interview, animal law protections are often driven by moral aspirations, how we ought to be more mindful of not exploiting animals and respecting their dignity. So with environmental law, with the science that drives these standards, if you take climate change, for instance, climate change science now tells us that we have a carbon budget within which we must operate if we're going to have a sustainable future. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is the group of international experts, climate scientists, without a political agenda, have come out and told us that we've pretty much got a decade to get things right in terms of mitigating our emissions. And we can establish scientific standards that say, you get to emit this much. It's kind of like you get an allowance for the week, and when you spend that money, you're done. we can establish that same standard at any level of governance, whether we do it at the global, regional, national, local, state level. And that can define what we mean by sustainable. That ultimately, there are examples now where courts have concluded that this big proposed coal mine, the permit is not issued because that coal mine, if allowed to proceed, would put that country out of its carbon budget, and therefore it should not be permitted. So if that's the sort of reasoning that we can embrace, there is a hope for a sustainable future, that we have to be driven by scientific standards that say what is and is not permissible for our shared ecosystem, and make our legal decisions and our business decisions on the basis of that information.
Hmm. All right. Well, let's see what else. Oh, one thing I wanted to define as well is green. Well, I think most of us are kind of familiar with greenwashing. Maybe you could speak a little bit about that, but also humane washing. Do you want to define those terms?
Yeah, this is another example. Another chapter in my book takes a look at how humane washing, which came later, can learn from the experience that environmental law had with greenwashing. So basically, these are very similar phenomena happening in different movements, but the same reality is happening. You've got the industry that wants to convince the consuming public to buy their products, and they're appealing to that sense of moral responsibility that the consumer has. So in the instance of greenwashing, the consumer is being told by the industry, buy our product, it's very sustainably uh, prepared in a sustainable way, has a minimum impact on the environment, and similar promises. And so there was a major scandal with Volkswagen in that regard about greenwashing in terms of the car's performance. So humane washing is the same idea in the animal context, and that an example of that would be buy our product because this product comes from a caring dairy. We are taking very good care of our animals. They are not, kept under circumstances that are inhumane. And ultimately, in both instances, you've got at least exaggerations of the truth, if not bold-faced lies. And so really, both of these contexts have been very successful in the courts, and it's essentially like catching your friend in a lie, that ultimately there is a process through which that statement, whatever it was to convince the public to buy the product, is evaluated under legal standards to determine whether it was deliberately misleading or just plain false. And there's a long history of law on this subject about what it means to engage in fraud and deception. There's a lot of civil liability standards that will hold that bad actor accountable if proven in court. And so there have been many successful claims brought by animal protection organizations on the humane washing side that say, look, our investigations revealed that you, Purdue or Tyson, you told the public that this is humanely raised chicken, but in fact, the investigations bore out that your regular chicken and your humanely raised chicken are subject to the exact same process. You're just trying to raise the price of the humanely raised chicken, so you're appealing to the standards of your consuming public that cares about animals, and it's a fraud.
Hmm. Okay, so if we know that these sorts of things are going on, do we contact a local animal rights organization or find a friendly lawyer or start a petition? Do petitions carry any weight?
They can. I mean, I think this litigation is becoming so common. There are firms that are easy to find now that specialize in this kind of work. One of the chapters on the humane washing in my book is co-authored by two lawyers whose firm is exclusively devoted to consumer protection work, and they're taking on a lot of these humane washing cases. So those are becoming more common. And then, of course, the animal protection organizations handle a lot of these cases as well. So absolutely bringing it to the attention of someone in the legal field who is doing anything related to either consumer protection or animal protection would be a good advocate for that cause. And it's very difficult to do it without the assistance of a lawyer. It's a very complex legal landscape on this.
Yeah, yeah. All right. Well, that we've covered a lot of ground there. Where could people get your books and maybe online articles or teachings?
Yeah, certainly. My books are available on Amazon. So the two books that we talked about, the most recently published ones, The Climate Change and the Voiceless, is from 2019, and the What Can Animal Law Learn from Environmental Law, second edition, was just published in July of 2020. And the articles that I've prepared, those are available by just typing in my name on Google, and I have them available on a Google Scholar page connected to my name, and also an academia.edu website. So either of those sources, you can access all of my writings, all of the articles for free, and the books are available for purchase on Amazon.
Are they anywhere else besides? Some of us just don't like Amazon.
They're available on the publishers' websites.
Okay.
So the Climate Change and the Voiceless is a Cambridge University Press publication, and the Animal and Environmental Law book is the Environmental Law Institute Press.
Okay, cool. That's great. And is there anything else you want to say before we go?
Well, it's just been great to have this conversation, and I want to stress that it's very much in the hands of the public and the governmental regulators to make this right. I want to end on an optimistic note. I am seeing progress on these issues, as difficult as they are. And in Canada alone, that recent development where the government offered financing for a plant-based facility, that is something that needs to happen on a grand scale. And ultimately in the US, and everywhere for that matter, but perhaps no more significantly these days than the US, elections matter. The vote for Trump versus Biden in the US has greater implications for where we go as a country than ever before in terms of one path or the other. With respect to these issues, animal and environmental protection issues, the choice could not be more stark, but it's on every issue in society, from healthcare to um, the economy to environmental protection. And so the other issue is the local dimension of these issues. So whether we're talking about animal law or environmental law, one aspect where, in fact, environmental law can learn a bit from animal law to stay viable is that edgy grassroots quality that environmental protection used to have in the 70s really has been lost. It's been somewhat institutionalized now, 50 years later. But animal law still has that edgy grassroots quality to it, and it's really a very positive trait. It's created more significant victories than I could have ever imagined. And two of those examples would be SeaWorld and the discontinuation of the captive orca breeding program there. That was largely due to grassroots organizing. And of course, the Blackfish documentary was huge in that regard. And then the other example of the 150-year tradition of elephants in Barnum and Bailey Circus, ultimately brought to its knees because of local petitions nationwide seeking to ban bullhooks that were used to torture those elephants. This was really a massive national victory for animal protection that was ultimately achieved by grassroots advocacy. So I always encourage people not to feel overwhelmed like they don't have a voice, that they can't make a difference. You just look to examples like that, whether it's on the animal side or on the environmental side, just how much is within our control. And we're seeing a lot of that now on the environmental side with climate justice. There's a lot of youth activism that has been incredibly impactful, winning major court victories all over the world. Again, the US hasn't been quite as successful that way, but certainly the cases are in the system and moving forward and raising awareness of the need for this kind of legal protection for future generations. So yeah, those are I would just crawl into a corner and cry if I didn't see this kind of hope for both these movements, because they can make great positive change, and it's within our grasp if we work together.
Yeah, I like to believe that as you mentioned, once people have the information, they're going to make better choices, and really it's capitalism is so fundamentally flawed. I'm not sure what the solution is in terms of trying to transition out of that, but it does run on a supply and demand, a simple supply and demand system, and so ultimately we do have a lot of power in that regard. I do have to just ask, because a lot of progressive voices that I'm hearing are very concerned that the DNC platform doesn't seem to be including a Green New Deal. They're not including universal health care, and they're not really all that much different fundamentally. They're a corporate-based party, and that they've recently just added nuclear energy back in. Apparently, they're going to. So I'm wondering, I get that elections are important, but what about like local elections and local laws, and are those important too?
Absolutely. So when you think about how the U.S. is responding to climate change, you can't just look at the executive branch and Congress. You have to look at the governance in each of the 50 states. And so California is a great example. California, if it were a country, is the 5th largest economy in the world. So to the extent that California is getting it right on climate change is really quite positive for the U.S. Even though it's only one of 50 states, it is a massive economic engine that is being actively regulated in the right way when it comes to climate change. So those state level elections and ultimately local elections can really go a long way when we're talking about protections for the environment or for animals. And in fact, federal protection for animals is almost impossible to secure these days. There are only 3 major federal animal laws in the US, and they're toothless, pardon the pun, whereas environmental law has many, many very effective federal environmental laws. So that reinforces this idea that state and local protections can be quite powerful and important, especially for animal law, since it's so hard to get those in at the federal level. And really the challenge also in thinking about what a federal government is doing, we tend to think about, oh, it's who gets elected, and that is, saving us or dooming us. It really is in the US about Congress. If there is Democratic control again in Congress after November 2020, that can be huge in terms of moving towards something like a Green New Deal. It doesn't matter whether Joe Biden embraces it or not. If you get the votes in Congress for that, and I think with Democratic control of Congress, in the Senate in particular, that is going to be achievable. I think I would have never said that 2 years ago, but there have been so many positive developments in that regard just in the past 2 years about this intersectionality of addressing climate change, that it has to embrace all of these other social problems that democracy has caused, capitalism has caused, that I'm seeing some hope for that if there is Democratic control of Congress, and it's not a matter of who that Democratic candidate is for president as much as it is getting the votes in Congress.
Okay, so again, I have a peripheral understanding of how things work, but I've heard that Joe Biden has said that he will veto a universal health care bill if it comes across his desk. Couldn't he just do the same with a Green New Deal?
I think it's less likely on the Green New Deal, but of course it's possible. And yes, the executive has a lot of power when it comes to an issue like climate change. But I think politics being the way it is and politicians being interested in re-election, I think climate change is perhaps more of an emergency issue in the public's mind now than perhaps even healthcare. It is so front and center, the perfect storm, if you will, of opportunity for action is here in 2020. And I think ultimately that I would be much more surprised to see a veto from him on something like the Green New Deal perhaps not quite as ambitiously worded as it is in its current form, but nonetheless, the concept of it, you have to realize for 30 years, we haven't even had a carbon tax. So going from nothing to the Green New Deal is close to impossible, but not impossible. But even moving in that direction is huge, and it's the only hope we have really in the U.S. We have to jump over 30 years of inaction to get to a good, if not a great place, literally overnight. So I think that impetus is there. The political will is there, unlike any other time in the past 3 decades. But yeah, he was not the crusader I was hoping to represent the Democratic Party.
Right? Yeah.
That's for sure.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting what you say, like 30 years that nothing has happened. Like really since Reagan, things have just become quite different there, it seems like. And so while I have you, maybe this is more of a constitutional law type question, but my understanding is that the whole way that the U.S. government system was set up was meant to be checks and balances so that no one body held the power. But it seems like somehow more and more power has been accumulated in the executive office. Has that happened within the last 30 years, or where?
I think it's fair to say that efforts have been made to do a power grab and bring more power to the executive branch. If you look to George W. Bush's efforts in the post 9/11 world, if you look at Trump's efforts in just about every issue, but ultimately they were all subject to legal challenge, and in the courts, many of those made it to the Supreme Court. So we do have. I think what is most reassuring about our checks and balances is that we have an impartial judiciary that even when it has a conservative majority, they have still reached decisions that dispense justice, that they're not just driven by political votes. So the one great example of that is the Obamacare decision, that was a conservative majority Supreme Court that did not strike down that healthcare plan when it was subject to legal challenge. So ultimately there, and then the same-sex marriage decision that came out just 4 years ago from the U.S. Supreme Court. That was a conservative majority court that upheld, recognized when it didn't have to, that there's a right, a constitutionally protected right to same-sex marriage. I mean, these anomalies happen in our judiciary because it is fundamentally impartial, unlike the other, the two political branches. So that is where climate change has the opportunity to make some progress, is that many of these efforts to do something are now cycling through the courts because we're not going to get anywhere with Congress and the executive until the election cycle filters out in November. So the judiciary has been a source of support, but very slow and very piecemeal in making progress on climate change.
Okay, and you mentioned California as sort of an example of what maybe other states could model. What specifically is California doing?
They're doing everything right, pretty much. So they were among the first to have a system that was very much mandated by the Kyoto Protocol of emission regulations, of a trading system very much like what was embraced in the EU, and they've had carbon tax. They've had a lot of environmental justice protections are built into their environmental laws. They are leading the way in terms of information access and dissemination on environmental issues. So really all of the big components of what it means to do effective environmental protection, including climate and energy, are there. It's just time and time again, you look to see what's going right in the U.S. on environment, and California is the model.
And are they setting precedents in animal law as well?
Not as much of a leader in animal law. I think there is a report card that the Animal Legal Defense Fund releases, and California might be in the top 10, but they're certainly not way at the top. So there are other states doing a better job for animals in the U.S. than California. It's certainly not a laggard, but it's not as strong on animal law as it is in environmental.
So who are setting the good examples for animal law?
I thought you would ask that. I know Oregon and Washington, I think, are quite strong. There's a couple of strong ones in surprising places. Like maybe Illinois is a leader. Even Florida isn't that bad. But New York, I believe, some of the ones that wouldn't surprise you are up there. But animal law is kind of hit or miss in that it doesn't really always align based on liberal versus conservative values, because it's such a broad spectrum of ways we can protect animals, and some of those that align more directly with human interests actually get very good protection in states that are otherwise conservative.
That's interesting.
So an example of that is like there's an anti-cruelty effort that is very much based on violence against spouses and children. There's an effort to establish a register of animal offenders. Those that abuse animals are put on a list like a registered sex offender. And so you're really protecting animals in a very effective way that's modeled on protections of humans. But that's just one of many categories of ways that animals are protected. So that same state might have no protections for animals in the food system, no protections for animals in medical research, and so forth. So animal law is challenging because it is so broad-based that way.
Well, I think as your young students graduate and become lawyers, that once there's plant-based people in the media and in the legal system and in the judicial system, that's when things are really going to change, I think.
I agree. It really does inform so many good social transitions. It's been eye-opening for me, and it's exciting to share that with students and inform them. I also advise a new student group on campus that was just formed that's called Friends of Animals, and it's really a plant-based advocacy group above all else, which is nice to have on our campus.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for taking the time today and for all the wonderful things that you're doing. And we'll watch out for your publications then.
Thank you very much, Janine. Really enjoyed the conversation.